It's the most basic theological question of all, and one that must be addressed before we can discuss the truth of the Word of God. How do we as Christians know that God exists? See, Christians today are blessed to live in a time where we have so much historical and scientific evidence supporting our case for a creator. And it's important to be well informed on this topic for whenever we're challenged and whenever skeptics challenge us on the existence of God or the truth of the Bible. In this video, I'm going to discuss 5 reasons why we know that God exists. But I want to encourage each and every one of you to research more into this yourselves. Before we begin, I want to first address that I'm ultimately arguing from the presuppositional position that God exists and everyone already knows that God exists. As Romans chapter 1 verse 20 states, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." The belief in God is already programmed into each of us, and believing in God is as easy as merely thinking about it. Since I don't believe in God isn't a good enough excuse for God, it's also not going to be a good enough excuse for me. So when someone tells you that they don't believe in God, they're ultimately lying to themselves and they're lying to you, because all of us already know that God exists, since it's self-evident. Here are 5 pieces of evidence to how we know God exists. Point 1. Objective morality exists. Why is murder wrong? Why is rape wrong? Why is stealing wrong? All of us know that these 3 things are wrong, but why? For the theist, this isn't an issue, since God is the objective moral standard. But for the atheist, since they deny God exists, they have no objective moral standard. And any moral statement they make becomes purely arbitrary. Without God, the statement "murder is wrong" holds as much weight as "I like ice cream." But since we all inherently know the difference between right and wrong and good and evil, we know that morality is not subjective. So since morality is objective, we know that God exists. The naturalistic position ultimately falls into the same trap that my presupposition was setting up. Because anytime they argue, they ultimately assume that God already exists. Thus, atheism is self-refuted. To say that society determines what is right and wrong is the bandwagon fallacy. If the consensus of the people were to say that murder is legal, that wouldn't make murder morally right. To say that morality is subjective is an absurd claim, because no one lives their life that way, and it doesn't reflect reality. Point 2. Cosmological argument. Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 tells us that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The scientific law of cause and effect tells us that for every effect there is a cause. So if the universe had a beginning, then logically what follows is that it also had a cause. For many years, atheists used to say that the universe was eternal and that it never had a cause. Unfortunately, the second law of thermodynamics refutes that claim, since everything ultimately succumbs to energy and breaks down. Thus, the universe cannot be eternal. Then, in 1929, Edwin Hubble made a monumental discovery by measuring the red shift. His observation proved that not only was the universe expanding, but that it also had a definitive beginning, just as the Bible had always said it did. So since the universe had a definite beginning, it must have had a cause, and it must have been caused by something that existed outside the space-time universe. This something must be eternal, since time had a definitive beginning when our universe was created, and this something must also be powerful to cause the entirety of the universe. These are attributes most commonly associated with God. Point 3. Intelligent design. The law of biogenesis states that life only comes from life. In fact, the origin of life is a huge problem for the atheist or humanistic ideologies. While microevolution is true in how it causes variations in animals, such as the numerous dog breeds, it cannot account for the origin of life. Matter of fact, it's such a huge problem that an honest scientist will call it a miracle. experiments have been done to try and solve the problem of how life originated from non-life, such as the Urey Miller experiment in 1953, which was a failure. In case you don't know, the Urey Miller experiment attempted to replicate the theorized conditions of the primordial soup hypothesis that explained how the most basic single-celled life forms arose. The yield of glycine was so small from those experiments that it was largely insignificant. In Miller's own words, the total yield was small for the energy expended. After hundreds of replications of the experiment, scientists were only able to produce small amounts of less than half of the 20 amino acids required for life. The only thing those experiments proved was how difficult it is for life to begin through naturalistic means. This has caused more and more scientists in recent years to question Darwin's theory as an origin for life and call for a re-examination. In fact, in 2013, the University of Oxford published a paper where Dennis Noble writes, "It is not only the standard 20th century views of molecular genetics that are in question. Evolutionary theory itself is already in a state of flux. In this article, I will show that all the central assumptions of the modern synthesis have been disproved. Origin of life aside, even the most basic organisms are throwing the theory of evolution into disarray, as they're discovered to be irreducibly complex, a term best described by biochemist Michael Behe. By irreducibly complex, I mean a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. Take the eukaryotic cell, for example, the same type of cells that make up our bodies and the bodies of all multicelled organisms. This cell is irreducibly complex, because if you remove, let's say, the mitochondria, just of the mitochondria from the cell, then the entire animal dies. The same applies to all the individual parts composing the cell, meaning that the eukaryotic cell must have come into existence all at once, exactly as it was, since it's impossible to function without all of the parts. When we look deeper into the cell, we discover DNA, which is even more complex than the eukaryotic cell, and a single DNA strand contains more information than even the most advanced computers we've built. The information contained within is complex, and specific information that builds biological machines, far outstripping any machines humans have engineered. DNA is also so precise that its genetic language, that it corrects its own mistakes, and the number of those errors it fails to catch is 1 per 10 billion letters. The more we learn about life, the larger the gap becomes for it to have originated without intelligence. And since I've already shown that the universe requires an eternal and powerful creator, all our scientific experiments and research has only shown that it takes intelligence far greater than our own to create life from non-life. Point number 4, the afterlife exists. In 2011, Dr. Jeffrey Long published a book titled Evidence for the Afterlife: The Science of Near-Death Experiences. In it, he investigated over 1,600 verified accounts of near-death experiences. First and foremost, it's important to understand that this book is not a religious book, but a scientific investigation into the science of NDEs. Secondly, a near-death experience is an out-of-body experience, which occurs by definition when the patient comes close to death. In some cases, the patient is deemed clinically dead before being resuscitated. These experiences often include out-of-body experiences containing reports of accurate information and have striking similarities between each other. In Dr. Jeffrey Long's investigation, he learned that these out-of-body experiences occur when the patient is clinically dead. Thus, They have no blood flow, their heart is not pumping, and they have no brain activity. In many cases, they saw their own bodies, and some of them even died in the operating rooms, yet were able to describe in vivid detail everything that had occurred after they died, including the panic in the hospital room and actual dialogue between the doctors. That immediately refutes the idea that these are mere hallucinations. There are also incidences of people being born blind, yet are able to see for the first time in their out-of-body experience. What's important to take away from these out-of-body experiences is that each of these people are fully cognitive and still have their own consciousness, despite their body having no brain activity. This indicates that our personality, thoughts, and consciousness is not connected to our brains, but our spirits. And the fact that our out-of-body experiences happen at all is evidence that we are indeed spirits inhabiting a physical body, just like how the Bible says we are. Then there are people like Yolaine Stout that actually met Jesus in their out-of-body experience. And this brings me to my fifth and final point, proving God exists. In fact, this next point is so strong that it's completely irrefutable. Point number 5, Jesus Christ. I believe that the strongest evidence for God is Jesus Christ. Born in Bethlehem from a virgin mother, Jesus was identified as the Messiah by Simeon when he was a boy, and he was again identified as the Messiah by John the Baptist. Jesus performed numerous miracles, such as calming a storm, healing the sick, walking on water, restoring sight to the blind, and even raised the dead. Jesus changed all of human history and even changed the calendar. He is a name known throughout the world. Miracles and teachings aside, Jesus outright said he was God in John chapter 8, verse 49 through 59. I was not seeking glory for myself, but there is one who seeks it, and he is the judge. Very truly I tell you, whoever obeys my word will never see death. This they exclaimed, now we know that you are demon-possessed. Abraham died, and so did the prophets. Yet you say that whoever obeys your word will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham? He died, and so did the prophets. Who do you think you are? Jesus replied, if I glorify myself, my glory means nothing. My Father, whom you claim as your God, is the one who glorifies me. Though you do not know him, I know him. If I said I did not, I would be a liar like you, but I do know him and obey his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. You are not yet 50 years old, they said to him, and you have seen Abraham? Very truly I tell you, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am. At this they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. It's important to understand that the Jews picked up stones because they thought Jesus committed blasphemy by saying he was God. For a better understanding of the context into what Jesus said, let's look at Exodus chapter 3, verse 1 through 14. Now Moses was tending to the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for this place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face, because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are opposing them. So now, go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. The name of God is I am that I am, or I am, which in the Hebrew language was Yud-He-Vav-He. So when Jesus said, Before Abraham I am, he was claiming to be one and the same as God, which is exactly why the Jews began conspiring to kill Jesus. And this is where Jesus proved that he was who he said he was when he rose from the dead, an event so miraculous that it even affected the burial cloth he was wrapped in. After decades of scientific scrutiny, the Shroud of Turin still baffles the world as one of history's greatest mysteries, and we've learned that the image of the shroud was made by light, something that we can't even replicate today with our modern technology. Of course, there are objections to Jesus being God, and I'm going to refute to debunk the claim that Jesus never existed. I'm going to prove to you that not only did Jesus exist, but we have more valid reason to believe the writings about Jesus than the writings of Julius Caesar. For Julius Caesar, the best documented evidence for him was written by his own accounts of the Gallic Wars, Cicero's speeches, and we know Cicero's eyewitness testimony is reliable because Cicero's writings influenced the founders of America when they wrote the U.S. Constitution. Sallust's account of Catiline's War, Suetonius' writing on Caesar, and Plutarch's writings. There's around 12 manuscripts accounting for Caesar. The oldest manuscript we have on Caesar is dated to the 9th century, a full 900 years after the actual events. The manuscript dates continue to 12th century, with Cicero's writings dated between 400 to 800 AD. Sallust and Suetonius' accounts were dated between 10th and 11th century. Now let's compare those to the writings about Jesus. The Roman citizen Theophilus hired the physician Luke to investigate the claims about Jesus at the time. That physician wrote both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. The Gospel of Luke specifically is praised by historians for its historical accuracy and is too accurate to the time period to be a fabrication. The Gospels of Matthew and John were directly written by eyewitnesses that were apostles to Jesus. Mark was a disciple of Peter. Thus, the Gospel of Mark is basically the Gospel of Peter. Then we have the writings of Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament. James, the brother of Jesus, wrote about Jesus, as did Jude. Remember how the earliest documents for Caesar date back to 900 AD? Well, prepare to be enlightened as to the superior reliability of the New Testament and for the greater number of writings about Jesus. Gospel of Matthew was written between 40 to 60 AD, Mark between 45 to 60 AD, Luke between 57 to 60 AD, John between 40 to 65 AD. The book of Acts, which was also written by Luke, dated between 60 to 62 AD, the writings of Paul beginning in 55 AD, James in 50 AD, Timothy in 65 AD, and Revelations in 95 AD, with the last written book of the New Testament. All of them within the 1st century, in the time of the original eyewitnesses to Jesus. 2 of the Gospels possibly written within 7 years after the crucifixion. Outside the Bible, the Roman historian Tacitus writes about Jesus in 115 AD. The Roman governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor, Pliny the Young, wrote about Jesus in a letter dated to 112 AD. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote about Jesus in the 1st century. expressing frustration that Christianity had not died out. And his writings verify that Jesus was crucified and verifies the claims of his resurrection. The Babylonian Talmud, compiled by Jewish rabbis between 70 to 200 AD, mentioned Jesus, calling him a sorcerer, acknowledging and verifying that Jesus performed supernatural miracles. Lucian of Samosata wrote about Jesus in the 2nd century and verified that Jesus was indeed crucified. Thallus wrote about Jesus in 50 AD, referencing the darkness and earthquake that occurred at Jesus' crucifixion, and that event was also referenced later by the historian Africanus. King Herod and Pontius Pilate, yes, the same Pontius Pilate that had Jesus flogged and gave him to the Jews to be crucified, both wrote about Jesus in letters. The claim that Jesus never existed is refuted by him having more documented evidence than a vast majority of ancient people such as Alexander the Great, Socrates, and even Plato, and by the documents pertaining to Jesus being closer to the actual event than the writings about Julius Caesar. And before you try to claim that we know Caesar existed because of statues isn't valid, because we also have statues of Zeus, so you have to go by the reliability of the historical documents, which favor Jesus. The claim that no eyewitness wrote about Jesus is refuted by the entirety of the New Testament being written within the 1st century, and even by the documents of Pontius Pilate himself. The claim that Jesus was copied from other mythology is refuted as the New Testament was written too early for it to become superstition, and the Jews, who despised Jesus to the point that they had him crucified, would have called him a sorcerer if he was mere fabrication. The claim that Jesus never rose from the dead is refuted by the empty tomb and by Paul, who went from a devout Jew persecuting Christians as he saw them as heathens, to writing much of the New Testament and becoming one of the strongest apostles of Jesus Christ. His sudden change happened when he personally saw Jesus after he rose from the dead, not to mention all the original eyewitnesses for Jesus after he rose from the dead and was tortured by Nero and Jews alike, with Nero even feeding Christians to lions and turning them into human lanterns because they refused to renounce the name of Jesus. The very idea that people would endure that kind of persecution for a lie is absurd. And remember Pontius Pilate, the man that had Jesus crucified? Well, here's an excerpt in Pilate's letter to King Herod. Know and see that in the day when thou didst deliver Jesus unto me, I took pity on myself, and testified by washing my hands that I was innocent, concerning him who rose from the grave, and after 3 days, and had performed thy pleasure in him. For thou didst desire me to be associated with thee in his crucifixion. But I now learned from the executioners and from the soldiers who watched his sepulchre that he rose from the dead. And I have especially confirmed what was told me, that he appeared bodily in Galilee, to the same form, and with the same voice, and with the same doctrine, and with the same disciples, not having changed in anything, but preaching with boldness his resurrection, and an everlasting kingdom. And behold, heaven and earth rejoice, and behold, Procla my wife is believing in the visions which appeared unto her, when thou sentest that I should deliver Jesus to the people of Israel, because of the ill will they had. Now when Procla my wife heard that Jesus was risen and had appeared in Galilee, she took with her Longinus the centurion and 12 soldiers, the same that had watched at the sepulchre, and went to greet the face of Christ, as if to a great spectacle, and saw him with his disciples. In terms of Jesus, there are 4 facts about him. Jesus existed as a man. Jesus performed many miraculous things. Jesus claimed to be God, and Jesus proved he was God by rising from the dead. Facts and irrefutable evidence that God is real and that he has already revealed himself to us in Jesus Christ. So the conclusion to all this. The atheist position is intellectually vacuous, and I see far too many Christians falling into this deception that atheism is the more rational and empirical position when, in reality, the theist position is the intellectually superior position. Through this video, I've shown exactly how solid and firm the theist position is. In fact, it's so strong that I consider it the default position of everyone and don't believe that a true atheist exists. These are the main reasons I've seen why atheists deny the existence of God. All of these reasons are the appeal to emotion fallacy. The problem with atheism isn't a mind issue, but a heart issue. The goal is to get to the heart of the issue and address the real problem, that they're angry at God and that God is not to blame for the problems of this world or the hardships they face in life. Rather, God is the solution. We argue with atheists not to win a debate, but to have Christ win them in the hopes that some can be saved. As Jesus said in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 through 30, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." It is my hope that this video either strengthened or reaffirmed your faith in the Word of God. It's important to stay informed so that we know how to answer skeptics, and it's equally important that we understand the real issue and can work on fixing their heart. Thank you for watching, and I hope each and every one of you has a blessed day.